We're continuing our study in the book of 1 Corinthians this morning. We've worked our way up to chapter 9. If you remember last week we talked about idols. Paul is discussing apparently a letter that the believers in Corinth sent to him. And one of their questions was about idols. And as Paul discussed idols, he made the point that the believers should surrender some of their rights for the benefit of those who don't have as strong a faith. That as believers we want to voluntarily yield our rights over to help people who may not have faith as strong as we do. And now, as we start chapter 9, Paul is going to use himself as an example. Paul is about to describe how he voluntarily surrendered some of his rights as an apostle in order to benefit the Corinthian church. So that those Corinthian believers are the beneficiary of the very thing he's asking of them, that they surrender these rights. Now, as we start into chapter 9, this chapter falls neatly into three different parts of Paul's arguments as he makes the case that he's giving up some of his rights. The first section, Paul establishes that he is an apostle, that he actually is an apostle. See, there were some in the Corinthian church who were saying that, Paul's not really an apostle. And they were saying this because they didn't approve of the way he earned money. They didn't approve of the way he went into the marketplace and worked like a slave to support himself while he preached the gospel. And so they made this accusation, and there's this rumors that, he's not really an apostle. Otherwise he wouldn't work this way. So Paul is answering these charges, and the first thing he establishes, as I said, is that he is an apostle. And then the second part of his argument is that as an apostle, he has a right to earn his living from the gospel. And he makes a very forceful case that in the Old Testament law and by the precepts of God, that those who share the gospel, who preach the gospel, should be able to live by the gospel. They should be able to make a living from preaching the gospel. And then Paul goes on to say, in the last part of his argument, that he didn't do that. That he preached the gospel to them freely, of his own will, of his own choice. He didn't take money from them because he didn't want to be any kind of burden on them. He wanted them to accept the gospel and not have to concern themselves with paying him. That he was happy to do this. It was his joy, a delight that he had to share the gospel in this way. So that's an overview of chapter 9. And now we start here. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 1. Paul asks a rhetorical question, am I not an apostle? Am I not free? Have I not seen Jesus Christ our Lord? And then the kicker, are not ye my work in the Lord? So Paul puts these questions out to make them think about what is an apostle, someone who learned from the Lord Jesus Christ himself, who saw Christ. And he tells the Corinthians, this church, your church is the very proof that I am an apostle. And he emphasizes that again here in verse 2. If I be an apostle unto others, yet doubtless I'm an apostle unto you, for the seal of my apostleship are you. That's what he emphasizes to them. You are my proof of apostleship. This very church. So now that he has established the fact that he is an apostle, now he moves into the second part of his argument here with verse 3. My answer to them that do examine me is this. So here's where we get the idea that people are questioning the legitimacy of Paul's ministry. They're asking questions about this and the way he goes about raising money. So Paul starts his argument, his answer, as it were, with another rhetorical question. Have we not power to eat and drink? Everybody needs to eat and drink. This is a known fact. If you don't take sustenance in your body, you're not going to live. We have to do this. Have we not power, verse 5, to lead about a sister, a wife, as well as other apostles, and as the brethren of the Lord and Cephas or Peter? So Paul here says that as an apostle, they can lead about a wife. They can bring a wife into ministry with them. This is what it means when it says a lead about, to fellowship, to partner in ministry with a wife, a sister. The word sister there means a believing wife. To lead about a believing wife is another way to say that. And Paul says that the other apostles are doing this. Jesus' brothers are married. Peter is married. So Paul is establishing these basic things in life: eating, drinking, having a wife. These are all rights of an apostle. Verse 6, or I only and Barnabas, have we not power to forbear working? To forbear profiting from the gospel? Verse 7, who goes a warfare at his own charge? Who planteth a vineyard and eat not the fruit thereof? Or who feeds a flock and eats not the milk of the flock? So Paul is making the point that there is the way the world works is when nations go to war, the soldiers are expecting to be paid. They're expecting to be paid to fight. And Paul recognizes that he's in a spiritual battle. He is in a spiritual war, and he could be expected to be paid for his service in the gospel. In a similar vein, the person who plants a vineyard can expect to eat the fruit of the vineyard. This is a natural expectation of the way things work in the world. A shepherd who takes care of the flock can expect to eat from the flock. This is the principle of sowing and reaping. And Paul says these things to help the people realize that being in ministry, the principle of sowing and reaping also applies to the task of being in ministry and preaching the gospel. Verse 9, say I these things as a man, or in other words, am I saying this only on my own? Or saith not the law also? So Paul says this is embedded. The idea of sowing and reaping, the idea of getting rewarded for your work, is codified in the Old Testament law. Verse 9, and he quotes the law. For it is written in the law of Moses, thou shalt not muzzle the mouth of the ox that treadeth out the corn. Does God take care for the ox? So God commanded the children of Israel that when an ox is treading the grain, you're not to muzzle that ox. And Paul says, did God only do this for the benefit of the ox? Was it only to benefit the ox? Or is there a deeper principle here that we can learn? And what Paul says is that he makes this point here. Did God say it altogether for our sakes? For our sakes, no doubt, it is written. For our sakes, it was for us that God said, don't muzzle the ox. This is a reflection of the character of God, not to be stingy. God wanted to give this example this law about muzzling the ox to help people think the right way. That the people should think about not being stingy with their goods, but to be generous. To be generous with their wares and the goods and the produce. So in other words, he said it altogether for our sakes. The law was passed not just for the ox, but also for the people. For our sakes, no doubt, this is written. And then he quotes another law, that he quotes this, he that ploweth should plow in hope, he that threshes should thresh in hope, should be partaker of his hope. So again, it's a principle of sowing and reaping applied to plowing. That God expects people to work, to have hope, to have the expectation that they will receive the reward of their work. That this is something that we can expect. And this is one of the evils of communism and this collective system, this government run system, that the government decides where the resources are allocated. That you work, the effort of your labor goes into the government, and the government redistributes it. This is an evil thing. This is not based on the principles of God. God says that the person should work and receive the reward for their own work. So market principles at work is what is presented in the gospel. Verse 11. If we have sown unto you spiritual things, is it a great thing if we shall reap your carnal things? So if we preach to you, is it so bad if we receive money for this preaching? Is it so bad that we would reap carnal things from our preaching? Verse 12. If others be partakers of this power over you, are not we rather? So apparently there were other preachers or philosophers, traveling monks as it were, that were collecting money from the Corinthian church for bringing them messages. And Paul says, if these other people can do it, shouldn't we also be able to expect that? Now there's a slight shift here. Nevertheless, we have not used this power. So here Paul starts to introduce the force of his argument, where he didn't claim these rights that were his. He says he did not use that power, but suffered all things, and he gives us the reason why he didn't use those rights. Suffered all things, lest we should hinder the gospel of Christ. Before he goes into the depth in the second part of his argument in verse 15, he continues here and makes another point. Do you not know that they which minister about holy things live of the things of the temple? So Paul brings in another example before he finishes his argument about living from the gospel, about the Levitical priesthood, how the Levites lived off of the produce of the tithes that the children of Israel brought to the temple. And that they which wait at the altar, those which work at the altar, are partakers of this produce. And then Paul finishes this section of the argument with this. Even hath so the Lord ordained, they which preach the gospel should live of the gospel. So Paul could have started with this. Jesus said that when you go into a village, don't stuff your bags with silver and gold, but go into the village, and that they should expect to receive hospitality from that village. He said this in Matthew 10, and he said this in, I think it was Luke 10 as well, Luke 10:7. Jesus said these things, that you can expect to live from preaching the gospel. So this is the end of the argument. Now Paul starts here the last part of his argument in verse 15. But I have used none of these things. Paul said, even though I had this right, even though it's a principle in life, this principle of reaping and sowing, I have voluntarily chose not to do this. Paul says, I am not taking money for preaching the gospel. I have used none of these things. Neither have I written these things so that they should be done for me. So Paul's not writing this letter in order to extort money from the believers. That's not the purpose of this letter that he's writing here. Then he says, it were better for me to die than that any man should make my glorying void. In other words, Paul says, I would rather die than take your money. This may be some literary hyperbole. I don't know if he meant that literally, but we do use the word die. I'm dying to visit my friends. That doesn't mean that you're going to die if you don't see your friends. It means that your life is diminished. The quality of your life is somehow diminished if you don't do these things. And Paul says that I would rather die than take your money. He's so adamant about this that he wants to preach the gospel without any hindrance. Remember, there's a number of slaves here in the Old Testament in these New Testament churches that didn't have any money. They didn't have any means to pay. And so Paul is voluntarily giving up his liberty, giving up this expectation of receiving payment for preaching the gospel. Verse 16, for though I preach the gospel, I have nothing to glory of. So Paul now here talks about why he's preaching the gospel. He says he's not preaching the gospel just to go on an ego trip. That's not why he's preaching the gospel. And there's some that are accusing some in politics of being in politics for an ego trip. And you can see where this may come from. Paul says, I'm not doing that. Paul says, for necessity is laid upon me, yea, woe is me if I preach not the gospel. There is something in Paul that is driving him to preach the gospel. He can't help but to preach the gospel. He is compelled to preach the gospel. For if I do this willingly, I have a reward. But if against my will, a dispensation of the gospel is committed unto me. So Christ commissioned Paul. He put a burning desire in his heart to share the gospel. And that's why he's sharing the gospel. That's why he is giving up his liberties. And Paul is holding himself up here as an example of how we should think about sharing the gospel with others. About the passion that he has to share this gospel. What is my reward then? Verily that I preach the gospel. That's his reward, that he is able to preach the gospel. It's a reward in itself to preach the gospel. That I may make the gospel of Christ without charge, that I abuse not my power in the gospel. In other words, he doesn't want anybody to feel like they're getting taken advantage of. He wants to do this freely. Verse 19. For though I be free from all men, yet have I made myself servant unto all. That's what he's asking the Corinthian church to do. To give up your liberties voluntarily. And that's what he has done. Paul has done this for them. He has made himself servant unto all, that he might gain more for the gospel. Unto the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might gain the Jews. To them that are under the law. As I might gain the Jews, stop there. And unto the Jews he became a Jew. So Paul, when he was in the presence of Jews, he behaved like a Jew. Not as a hypocrite, not in a hypocritical way, but he behaved like a Jew so that he would have some affinity to talk to the Jewish people. He didn't go in there with a big BLT sandwich. He went and behaved like a Jew to order their respect, that they would listen to him. To them that are under the law, as under the law, that I might gain them that are under the law. So this is a repeat of what he said earlier in verse 20. This is a repeat of the idea that to those who are under the law, that he behaves as he is under the law, that he might gain them. And now verse 21, he switches. To them that are without the law, Paul acts as a Gentile. That's what those who are without the law, the Gentiles. Paul acts as without the law. Now he puts a parenthetical note in here, this little parenthesis. He explains being not without the law to God, but under the law to Christ. So what Paul's saying here is, when he says that he is not under the law, what he means is he's not under the Old Testament law. He's not under the law of Moses. Paul says he is under the law of Christ. There's a big difference between being under the law of Moses, the Jewish law, and being under the law of Christ. The law of Christ is it gives a person much greater liberty to that they can be guided by the Holy Spirit. This is the law of Christ. And Paul says the law of Christ reigns in his heart no matter who he's talking to, Jew or Gentile. So he says this in this note, when he says, to them that are under the law as without the law, that I may gain them that are without the law. So when Paul is dealing with Gentiles, he behaves as a Gentile. This is allowed in the law of Christ. And he does this for their benefit. In the same vein, verse 22, to the weak, in other words, to the slaves, to those who were nothing in society, he became nothing. He became weak so that he might gain the weak. He is able to identify with his audience. Paul is able to identify with the people that he's talking to in order to gain them to Christ. And you know what it's like when you talk to somebody and you sense you're not really on the same wavelength with that person. You sense that there's barriers between you and this person you may be talking to. Whatever those barriers are, when those barriers are there, you have trouble communicating. And Paul says he wants to eliminate as much of those barriers as possible when he preaches the gospel with people. Continuing in verse 22, I am made all things to all men, that I by all means save some. Not everybody that he talks to is going to believe. But glory be to God that some people believe. Some believe. Some believe. Verse 23, and I do this for the gospel's sake, that I might be partakers thereof with you. In other words, Paul says that he's in the same boat with the Corinthian believers. We're in this together. Now here in verse 24, Paul switches, and this chapter ends with an example of an athlete. So in Corinth, there were the famous Isthmus Games that were held every couple of years. The athletes would come from all over the known world to participate in these games. It was well known in the ancient world. And now Paul draws on these games to make an example. Verse 24, know you not, going the wrong way. Know you not that they which run in a race run all, but one receives a prize. Only one person in this race is going to get the prize. Even though they're all running. And what Paul says And every man that striveth for the mastery is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a corruptible crown, but we an incorruptible crown. So what Paul is saying here is that we strive to win. Paul is not encouraging us to compete against our neighbor. Paul is encouraging us to manage our bodies, to manage ourselves, to temper ourselves, to be temperate in our appetites, in our desires, in the way we manage our lives, like an athlete is. That these athletes sacrifice a lot in order to prepare themselves to run in the race. And that the Christian should view this life as in one sense, as an athletic event. And that the same mindset that the athlete adopts, that there is a fit example for the Christian to adopt as well. The athlete is careful of what they eat. They're careful to get the proper rest, the proper nutrition, the proper exercise. The athlete doesn't just exercise in some half-hearted slapdash way. They have a training plan that requires a lot of discipline to do this. This is what Paul says. The Christian life requires discipline, just like a life of an athlete. It's a mindset. It's the way we think. Paul wants to help them think the right way. And Paul, using himself an example, I therefore run, not as uncertainly. So Paul is running his race. He is being a Christian with purpose and meaning and discipline. And he's pursuing life as an athlete would. Continuing in the same vein, so fight I, not as one that beateth the air. So now, instead of thinking of a runner, he thinks of a boxer. And somebody who is training to box doesn't just shadow box all the time. You want to get in there and have it and train with throwing punches and receiving punches, so that when you get in the ring, you know what that feels like. You can't just shadow box and expect to go in the ring when the time is there to make an actual fight. You have to prepare yourself and harden yourself so that you can. So Paul says, so he can fight as a worthy fighter, as a worthy opponent. But I keep under my body and bring it into subjection. So this is the point. Paul is managing his body. Paul manages his appetites. He manages his desires. He manages these things in his life so that he can run the race, so that he can glorify God with his life. Lest that by any means, when I have preached to others, I myself should be a castaway. This doesn't mean that Paul is going to lose his salvation, but what he means is that he's going to lose his effectiveness for Christ. That if he knows that if he leads an undisciplined life, he's not going to be an effective minister of the gospel. He's not going to do what's expected of him. When somebody hires you to work, as it were, you're expected to go to work and to work. Not to slough off, drink coffee, or sit around and tell jokes. You're expected to do your work. And that's what Paul says. He wants to be effective. He wants to work for Christ, work for God. And to do this, he disciplines himself. He encourages the Christian church, the Corinthian church, to do the same thing. And he encourages us here today to discipline our lives as well. Hallelujah.